Welcome to the Women Arise podcast, where you'll hear firsthand stories from around the world of women working together to overcome challenges they face.
Welcome to the Women Arise podcast. This is a special edition focused on the coronavirus and the faith leaders' response to it. With us today, I have Rabbi Joshua Lesser, who is with the Congregation Bet Haverim in Atlanta, Georgia. I want to welcome you.
Well, thanks. I'm appreciative of the invite and looking forward to this conversation. It's an important one.
It really is. It really is. This has really taken us by storm. I don't think that any of us could have ever imagined something like this happening.
I agree. I think that part of why having spiritual and faith communities being a reason is that hopefully we can be places that help people adapt and address when the unexpected happens. And unfortunately, the unexpected has happened.
So can you tell me how your congregation is responding to this crisis?
Sure. I think Atlanta is a few weeks behind some of the cities that have been harder hit, like New York and Seattle. And so just this week, we've started dealing with restaurants closing, gyms closing. And so we are at the very beginning of people experiencing more solitude, more people self-quarantining. And so we as a congregation, I would say we started as we saw this coming. Part of the Jewish tradition relies upon studying texts. And I brought a text study to the congregation as a way to engage what our thoughts are. And it was a text that had us begin to explore what are relationships between prevention and precaution, and what are the values that we might take some calculated but still risks to enact. So for instance, I am going to do a wedding this weekend. There are a lot of people who have said no weddings. This is a wedding that has been pared down from 200 people to 15. So there's some sadness, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
We as a congregation, this will be our first weekend where we are fully moving to only virtual services, like many other congregations are doing. And we're trying to get our community up technologically. We're trying to get them connected technologically so that they can participate. In the little trials that we've done so far, it's been amazing how appreciative people have been of the connection. And then I have started calling all of the folks along with my staff. We're trying to reach all of the most vulnerable people in our community, folks who are 70 and over, and people who live with chronic illness or have some compromised health issues right now, just to make sure they have what they need, that they have food, that they have support. And ultimately, we're in the process of trying to create partners so that people are checking in on each other. And my motto in this time has been physical distancing with social connection.
I love that. Well, I want to back up because there's been a few things that I've thought, I want to jump in and ask a follow-up question. So one, can you share one of the texts?
Yes. So in Jewish tradition, there is a series of books called the Talmud. And the Talmud is essentially a commentary on the Hebrew Bible, or what other folks call the Old Testament. But it explores and goes very far reaching places. And so the one text that I'm talking about talks about this ancient disease called Ra'atan. And it starts talking about some of the symptoms. And interestingly, not all, but some of the symptoms are similar to the COVID-19. So you just get a sense that our ancestors were dealing with illness in their time. And then they say different rabbis' responses. And so one rabbi says, he won't sit downwind of people who have this illness. There's another rabbi who says, I wouldn't eat food that is sold in the alley of where somebody lives. Another rabbi says, beware of the flies that might be coming off of somebody who has this illness. But the final rabbi, his name is Joshua ben Levi, says, it says that he connected to the people and he studied Torah with them because, quoting the Psalms, just as the Torah is graceful like a doe, he then asks, isn't it also healing? And so, I recognize that we all have our responses, but for me, I wanted to use that text as a way to invite people to recognize there are limits, that it's okay for us to put in our limits, and that each of us has the responsibility to determine that ourselves, perhaps with support. I want to support people in their best decision-making. And then, perhaps if we're taking those precautions, do we have to distance ourselves completely? Could we do things like be in companionship, connected, as it says in this text, which I feel is really important? And for him, that was about studying Torah. For us, it will likely be, would we risk dropping off food for somebody who is more compromised? Would we find time to have a phone call for somebody who might feel lonely during these times? Would we volunteer at a food pantry as we look at this being something that is enduring more than just a week or two, but probably months? And so I have a feeling that even our decision-making is going to begin to change, and that I want people to be able to do that from a very safe and values-connected place, rather than have our boredom or our restlessness kind of lure us into making poor choices.
Yes. And one of those is really spiraling into fear and depression out of the isolation. You said that you've got a wedding coming up this weekend, and I can't imagine what that would be like for the bride, the bride's family, groom and groom's family. Such a radical adjustment from everything that they've planned for and hoped for. How are you counseling people through that transition?
I think that's important if we can be, and I would say my spiritual work is to be as least anxious as possible, to bring a sense of calm, and also to really be able to, I'm a big proponent that we need to grieve all of the little things. There's a lot of our American philosophy of being bootstrapping people. And I would say that I am someone who has pulled myself up from my bootstraps a number of times. And while that is a helpful tool, I think it sometimes does not allow us to recognize the vulnerability that we feel, doesn't allow us to honor that there is loss. Even in the face of larger losses that are being experienced by other people, it is okay. And that I believe if we don't recognize these small losses, we can't easily get to the place of gratitude. So, part of how I counsel is really about listening and making sure they're able to say what is really going on for them and creating space, and not saying, oh, it could be worse, or, trying to make it a cheerier picture than they might feel, until they've been able to pour out everything that they need to say. And then I begin to ask, important questions around what is still worthy of celebrating on this day? What feels most important to bring? Given all of our limitations, how can I support you best? And when we begin thinking those ways, it begins to invite our acceptance of reality, and then how we can show up in the moment of that reality that feels important. Because if we're stuck in the past wedding that we were hoping to be at on that day, we will all be miserable. But if we're able to actually grieve and let go of that wedding, and be able to stand in a moment where something different, but also possibly joyful and beautiful can emerge, it's going to be more deeply meaningful. And I think this couple will have a celebration down the road where they'll be able to have all of their friends and family.
Yeah.
And, I think dreaming is also not a bad spiritual practice as well.
Exactly.
We should keep our dreams.
Yeah, absolutely. And use our imaginations for good rather than like imagining the worst, which, we see some of that happening in the world. This, as far as I can tell, is the first pandemic in the global communications age.
Yes.
Where we can reach people all over the world and we can reach so far beyond our walls. And you've created a group on Facebook that has been really helpful to me. And it's called the Clergy and Spiritual, I just clicked out of it. Clergy and Spiritual Communal Responses to COVID-19.
Yes.
And I so appreciate that you've done that. Tell us about how that got started.
One of the things that I've recognized about myself is that at times like this, there's a little bit of what I would call first responder energy. And so I think as a clergy person, as a rabbi, I think that of that spiritual first response. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that felt really important to me is that for the long run, alongside our medical practitioners, which, bless them and bless all of the caretakers and everybody who is truly on a first line, that we have the possibility of being an important and healthy support to people surviving and maybe even thriving in a new age. But that what we need is a community where we can be open and honest with our frailties and our vulnerabilities, where we can express our frustrations, where we can share resources. And so, at first I thought, I'm going to create this Facebook page for probably 150 of my multi-faith friends. And, I recognized that, I didn't want to keep it a closed and private group. It's closed for clergy and people who work. I want to be as expansive in that term as possible so that as many people can get help. But that, seminarians and people who are working in spiritual communities can have a place where we can be in solidarity with one another for good. A week in, we're over 4,500 people, and there's over 1,000 people that need to be accepted through our moderation. So we're growing rapidly, and already what has been shared has been phenomenal and even a little bit overwhelming.
How are you dealing with like your daily diet of information? Do you have any pointers?
I think that that's really a keen insight, that I think it's important for us to be able to scope in and scope out, that we're able to actually we wouldn't necessarily see this as a news source, but that we actually check in with our own bodies. Like that part of what we need to do is, before we go on to listening to our news, is to actually take a little bit of a survey of our own selves. Like, how are we doing in our bodies? How are we doing emotionally? How are we doing spiritually? And listen to that news feedback from our own selves. And then I think to be able to intentionally take in the necessary amount of information, and to find times throughout the day where we limit that. And I also think that there are some really important other things that are happening. If we just talk about folks here in the United States, our elections and our democracy and how our democracy is going to adapt in this moment feels important. And while there are some relationship to this pandemic, I think that we shouldn't lose, regardless of what our political beliefs are, we shouldn't lose what those beliefs were 3 weeks ago. Right? If we are concerned about how things are happening in our country, if we're concerned about homelessness, or if we're concerned about hunger, those things are not actually going away, and they're worsening because of this. I think it's really important. One of the things I asked my congregant who was sharing with me stories and telling me about rationing recipes, and I should look them up, and is I asked her to write something to send out to our congregants. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from our history. My particular congregation was founded by LGBT folks, and shortly after was when the AIDS epidemic hit. And so I wrote, though I was not here at the founding of my community, but knowing our history, is that one of the things, and I would say that now we're a very diverse community of lots of different folks who really support one another. So I've taken this opportunity to educate our community now about our history, about having felt other, and then during the AIDS epidemic, where there was a tremendous amount of stigma. In some ways, the kinds of stigma that unfortunately many Asian Americans are feeling right now, and the kind of xenophobia that is affecting them. But I talked about how even when we didn't necessarily know as much about AIDS and HIV as we do today, our community's response was to start essentially a ministry to make sure that people had meals, that people were taken care of, and people were willing to take those kinds of risks that I was talking about when we looked at the text.
Yeah.
And that what might it look like today for us to respond with compassion? How might we make sure that people who are affected with COVID-19 or caretakers are not alone and isolated and shunned with a sense of stigma, but rather know that they're a part of our extended spiritual communities, feels really important as we move into a greater sense of progression. And there's so much of our history that we can draw from that can inspire us to rise to what's possible in our global age right now in terms of using our technology in new ways. And the other thing, alongside Rosie Riveter and the solidarity of the women that you're speaking about, that's what I also feel in our Facebook group, is that all of these clergy, many of them who are not so comfortable with technology, all of us learning together about how we're adapting in this moment to best serve our communities and being pushed and striving to do well so that we nourish and support our communities has been really inspiring to me. There was one quick story where this new rabbi put out this past Sunday morning saying, I know many of you are trying Zoom and other platforms for the first time. I will be here this morning waiting in this room so that if any of you have technical difficulties, consider me to be your tech guy. And that kind of interfaith partnership and solidarity to me is quite touching.
It's beautiful, isn't it? And that's, we all face this pandemic together. It's not based on anything else other than we're human.
Yes.
You can be any religion, you can be any sexual orientation, any political party, whatever, immigration status. We are all facing this together. And so this is a beautiful point in time where we could really unify our voices for good and come together. And, you said something about the congregants who are not proficient with technology. How are you bringing them into the conversation?
So this Friday is going to be our first big experiment. And I am working to try to be on 3 different platforms and making sure that there is a call-in option, either through free conference call or through Zoom's calling, so that for folks who, for their first time, just want to follow along on the phone, that's just fine. And that most of our folks know how to dial a phone number. But I think that we'll be offering through email tips and opportunities for people to explore on off times so that they can get onto Zoom and be able to explore and see what the options are, how to mute and unmute out of a worship setting so that they develop some more comfort. Our denomination has been really wonderful. I'm from the Reconstructionist movement within Judaism. We're one of the smallest, but kind of grassroots and progressive movements. We, rather than very much like the hand sanitizers, I would say that we're the least. I would say we're the most economically challenged of all of our denominations in some way. Instead of trying to sell prayer books at this time, they've made our prayer books digital so that we can make it accessible to everybody. And that to me is the spirit that we can all carry forward.
Yes, that's wonderful. I know, one thing that I would absolutely love to do and don't have the funding to do it is get iPads for older congregants and teach them how to FaceTime. And because I think that it's going to be like, especially as long as this looks like it's going to go on, it's going to be really hard for them not to see grandchildren or great grandchildren. And a tool like FaceTime could be so great.
Absolutely. I think that, we are not there yet as a faith community. I've been explaining to folks who have wanted lots of content and lots of things very quickly, that particularly here in the South, where we're lagging behind, luckily, that we're following things sequentially. All of the decisions that all of our faith communities have had to make as new and different information has come along has taken a lot of time and process, and we're adapting. But I do think that we will move into a period of time where we'll be able to leverage our collective voices to some of the wealthiest corporations to potentially support initiatives like you're talking about. Wouldn't it be great for folks who could afford it easily to be able to supply folks with the tools that they need not to be so isolated? Mm-hmm. And for us to understand that it isn't just, that loneliness is one of the most deadly of diseases, and it certainly can be as contagious as something like COVID-19. And so we need to guard against loneliness as well. But that also in the face of emergencies and needs that are going to happen, to be able to have tools, mm-hmm. to be able to, ensure that our members can afford Wi-Fi, and to have the kinds of things that will make communication that we might have taken for granted because of our access now becomes crucial. How do we do that? And how might we also use our voice to our elected officials to basically say, join us in this humanitarian moment? Mm-hmm. And I know many of them want to, and sometimes they just need a little encouragement from a good faith voice.
Yeah. Calling upon the better angels.
Yes, absolutely.
So this has been a great conversation. What have we not covered that you would really like to share?
I think people could have inferred this, but I think it's important to understand that as clergy, we're human too, and that there are ways where we will be able to provide what is needed if there's space for some of our own self-care. And so if there are other clergy that are listening to us, I really want to encourage the balancing the urgency of the need out there, because it's real, with a sense of making sure that we aren't endangering ourselves in a variety of ways, because we need to be part of the solution in this long term. And so I want to invite all of us to pace ourselves, to be gentle with ourselves, understanding that much of us are on different learning curves and that we're adapting to new information on a pretty rapid basis. And I'm just so When I see all of the stories online of people acting in their most basest ways, the kind of hoarding, the kind of fights that are breaking out in grocery stores, I'm compassionate to what that level of fear and anxiety might lead to us, or that kind of selfishness. We will all be so much better off if we can recognize our interconnectedness. And that, to me, is the message of this moment. We're interconnected, and that our global technological communication age is showing that in really powerful ways. My Facebook page allows me to connect with a minister in New Zealand. And that, to me, if we can harness our good, that we will be inspiring people to do their best.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to meet you.
It's so great to meet you. And I look forward to continued collaboration with you and for all of the good that will come out of this.
Amen.
Thanks for listening to the Women Arise podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to the show so you never miss a single episode. For more information or to make a donation to support the efforts of Women Arise, please visit womenarisecollective.org.